Guten Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. It's great to be learning with you on a Friday afternoon. Let's light up the darkness. I realized the last class I never lit the candle. I want to make sure I got it right away. Who's in the house as we emerge from Pesach? We are counting the Omer. Last night we counted the 8th night. We're counting 49 days from Passover to Shavuos. This is known as Sephiros HaOmer. It is a time of doing that mitzvah of counting the days every day, commemorating when we counted the days, so to speak, from the Exodus from Egypt until receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. The 7th day of Passover, which is its own holiday, commemorates going into the midst of the sea. The sea parts on two sides, and the children of Israel walk through on dry land. And then our oppressors, the Egyptians, Pharaoh and his chariots, the elite army, the most powerful army in the world, was drowned in that sea. We heard some beautiful teachings over Passover, how you can take the Jew out of slavery, but you don't necessarily take the slavery out of the Jew, right? And that's such an important inside teaching for all of us, that sometimes that solution to the problems that we've been having, that next step forward in life is just right in front of us. But we're still in that oppressed mentality that we had that's been bogging us down even when the door has opened. In college, I was an English major, and I wrote a big paper on D.H. Lawrence, right? I remember reading D.H. Lawrence, and he had a book that really struck me called The Virgin and the Gypsy. He said that many people, or maybe most people, live their lives in a jail cell with the key to that cell hanging on a chain around their neck where it dangles inert, right? Like we know, we possess the solutions to the big problems in our lives. There is a way forward, but our mentality gets so bogged down in those ruts, in those patterns, in that that behavior that keeps us from moving forward, that even when the possibility is there, we don't take that step, right? And so again, the Jews came out of slavery in Egypt, and then Pharaoh's army comes pressing down on them, and that's when we said, we right, not they, we said to Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness? Infuriated God, but he stayed with us, and he showed Moses the way. And when the people finally got through that ocean and to the other side, and saw that their problems really had been put behind them with the help of God, that now there was a new road before them, and they could finally breathe easy and take that step forward. And we're in that time right now. So it might be that you in your life are confronting, major issues, major problems, patterns of behavior, and you're saying, well, someday, but someday could be today, right? Maybe this is the day where you just know what, I can take that step. I'm not going to be stuck in my old mentality. All right, who's in the house today as we're learning on a Friday? Melissa in Great Neck, Shandor in the Bronx, Gordo in Scotland, welcome. Bill in Mid-Missouri, Gosia in Chicago, James in Indianapolis, Judy says Shabbat Shalom, Judy Lee. Jay Yitzhak in Minnesota, Karen in Northern California, Marjorie in Georgia, Debbie in New Jersey, Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. And Debbie says, counting the Omer? There's an app for that. Yes, there is. There's a good app for that. Just Google that, Counting Omer app. All right, big daf, big page today. This is page Yud Aleph, page 11 here in Tractate Sotah, the 18th volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, these are the laws of the suspected adulteress and the ritual she undergoes when the temple is standing. Drinking the bitter water shows her innocence, and then the husband and wife can become permitted to each other again. We are in chapter 1, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 6, and we're having some beautiful kind of digressions. We're keyed off on the concept in the Mishnah that God rewards or punishes measure for measure, right? So that in the way that people, first we saw that in the way that people regard others, so are they regarded. In the harm that they do in this world, so are they held accountable, measure for measure. And now we're going to continue the discussion of that Mishnah with the idea that God also rewards measure for measure. He punishes measure for measure, and he rewards measure for measure. And the Mishnah teaches, and the same is so with regard to the reward for good deeds. Miriam, Moses' sister, waited for the baby Moses for 1 hour at the shore of the Nile, when the baby was placed in the basket, because Pharaoh had decreed that all the baby boys would be killed, because he'd received a prophecy, right, that the Jews would rise up against him, they would leave, and they would be led by a man. And so he's trying to forestall that fate and get rid of all the baby boys. But Moses was saved, right? So they put him in a basket, and Moses' sister watched that basket float up the Nile until it was pulled from the water by Pharaoh's daughter, Basia. So Miriam waited for the baby Moses for 1 hour at the shore of the Nile. Therefore, the Jewish people delayed their travels in the desert for 7 days to wait for her when she was smitten with Saras, right? Once we were in the wilderness coming out of Egypt. So the Gemara asks, are these matters comparable? There, Miriam waited 1 hour, while here the Jewish people, the entire Jewish people, millions strong, waited for her for 7 days. And Abaye said, say this with a slight change. And with regard to repaying of good, it is not so, as a person is not rewarded precisely measure for measure, as the reward may be greater than the good deed. Rava said to Abaye, but the Tana in our Mishnah said, and the same is so with regard to the reward for good deeds. Don't say that he said it is not so. He said that it is so. And the same is so with regard to the teaching of good deeds. It is rewarded with the same measure. A person is rewarded in the same manner as the good deed. But the measure of good is always greater than the measure of punishment. Therefore, Miriam was rewarded in the same manner as, but in a greater measure than her deed. Right? She is rewarded accordingly. She waited for Moses, they waited for her, but the measure is greater. So with regard, right, and it's a beautiful teaching, meaning that God punishes us because he has to punish us. It's very similar to a parent and a child. You punish the child because you have to punish him or her so that they learn the lesson and remember it. But you're much happier rewarding the child for the good deeds that they do, and you're happy to reward them way beyond what they deserve. Now, with regard to Miriam's deed, the verse states, and his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Exodus 2:4. So Rabbi Yitzchak says this entire verse is stated in reference to the Shekhinah, the divine presence of the Lord, i.e., each phrase, and his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Each phrase in this verse alludes to the divine presence watching over Moses. And now we start to break it down. And his sister stood, as it is written, and the Lord came and stood. Right, so we're referencing this verse in Exodus, and his sister stood, and we're now going to connect it to a use of that same word, stood, in 1 Samuel 3:10. It is written, and the Lord came and stood. His sister, as it is written in Proverbs 7:4, say to wisdom, you are my sister. Afar off, as it is written, Jeremiah 31:2, from afar the Lord appeared to me. To know, as it is written, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, 1 Samuel 2:3. What, as it is written, what does the Lord require of you? Deuteronomy 10:12. Would be done, as it is written, for the Lord God will do nothing. Amos 3:7. To him, as it is written, and the Lord said to him, peace be with you. Judges 6:23. In other words, every phrase can be linked to another phrase similar somewhere else in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, showing that God is near, right? That God was watching over that basket. There was no accident that the basket containing baby Moses ended up in safe hands with Pharaoh's daughter. Now, the Gemara proceeds to discuss the sojourn of the Jewish people in Egypt. Now, the verse states, and there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Right? Joseph saved Egypt from the famine and made Egypt the most powerful country on earth, that they had a storehouse of food when everyone else was enduring a terrible, terrible famine. Other countries came to purchase food from Pharaoh, and since they were the only ones that had food, you can imagine the prices. And it made Egypt supremely powerful, and Egypt, and as in personified by Pharaoh, were very grateful to Joseph for all of Joseph's lifetime. But eventually, Joseph's lifetime ended, and we don't know exactly how many years after, but soon there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph and what he had done for Egypt, but rather they saw this Jewish people who were multiplying at an extremely high rate and started to say, oh, there's too many of them in our country and it's going to be a problem for us. How are we going to deal with them? Let's enslave them. Right? And now we're going to sort of break down that process here. And there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Exodus 1:8. So Rav and Shmuel disagree about the interpretation of this verse. One says that this means he was actually a new king, and one says that this means that his decrees were transformed, as if he were a new king. Right? That it was the same king who just changed his mind about the role of the Jews in Egypt. Others say, no, it was a new king who forgot the relationship that Joseph had with the former king. Now, the one who says that he was actually a new king holds that it is because it is written new. It says a new king, it must be a new person. And the one who says that his decrees were transformed, that it was the same king who started to behave differently, holds that it is because it is not written, and the previous king of Egypt died and a new king reigned. And this indicates that the same king remained. So according to this interpretation, the words, who knew not Joseph, means that he was like someone who did not know him at all. Although he certainly knew Joseph and his accomplishments, he acted as if he didn't. Right? So we don't have an answer for that. We just have a machlokas, a dispute over whether it was actually a new king or not. Now the next verse states, and he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Exodus 1:9. It was taught in the Tosefta at 4:11. He, Pharaoh, initiated the proposal. Therefore, of his people, he was stricken first. He initiated the proposal as it is written, and he said to his people, right, to his advisors. Therefore, he, Pharaoh, was stricken first, as it is written, and the frogs shall come up both upon you and upon your people and upon all your servants. But the frogs came up upon Pharaoh first. The next verse states that Pharaoh said, come, let us deal wisely with him, lest he multiply, and it come to pass that when there befalls us any war, he will join our enemies and fight against us. Who is he? He's talking about the entire Jewish people, but referring to them with the singular person, he. Very interesting. So often we hear that what is holding the Jewish people back is the extreme number of disputes and lack of unity among ourselves. We're always arguing with each other. When do we become unified? When we have the common enemy, right? I mean, in the concentration camp, tragically, all the Jews were united in their plight. Right? But when we're free to do whatever we want, so this guy goes this way, that guy goes that way, and we don't have unity. Our enemies serve the purpose sometimes of unifying us. That's not what it says exactly right here, but it's something worth noting. Okay, but nevertheless, it does say in the Torah, come, let us deal wisely with him. So the Gemara comments, Pharaoh should have said in plural, with them. Let us deal wisely with them, rather than the singular. So Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says that Pharaoh was saying, come, let us deal wisely with regard to the Savior of Israel, referring to God. God is one. So his advisors asked, with what form of death shall we judge and decree upon them? If we shall judge them with fire, perhaps we will be punished measure for measure by fire. That's why this is coming up now, this punishment measure for measure. As it is written, For behold, the Lord will come in fire. And it is written in the verse that follows it, for by fire will the Lord contend. And similarly, we cannot judge them with the sword, as it is written in the continuation of that verse, and by his sword with all flesh. Right? They had the sense that this God of the Jews is powerful. Maybe we should be careful exactly the manner that we pick on his people, the Jews. So dangerous to, fight them with fire or to fight them with the sword. So they're going to come up with a different idea. By the way, we're a few pages behind. Eventually we'll catch up. I'll do multiple pages in a day, but I didn't want to skip these pages because they're so rich with beautiful material. But note that this page 11 about Israel's sojourn and their enslavement in Egypt fell right during the Passover holiday. No accidents. So rather, said Pharaoh's advisors, let us come and judge them with water by drowning the Jewish babies. God will not punish us with water, for the Holy One, blessed be he. I don't know if they use that terminology about God, but okay. Already took an oath that he will not bring a flood upon the world, as it is stated, for this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth. Right after the incident of the flood in Noah's ark, God swore that he would never again destroy the world through water. Right? He would not bring another flood. So maybe Pharaoh's advisors said, God said he's not going to punish the world with water again. So if we punish the Jews and drown the male babies with water, maybe we won't suffer, retribution in return, since God won't use water again. He himself said so, according to the Jewish tradition. So the Gemara comments, and Pharaoh's advisors did not know that he will not bring a flood upon all the world, but he may bring destruction by water upon one nation. God just said he wouldn't destroy the whole world. And alternatively, another way to understand this, there is an additional way to punish the Egyptians with water. He does not bring a flood upon them, but they may come and fall into the water. And so it says, when Pharaoh's army pursued the Jews coming out of Egypt, and the sea returned to its strength when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians fled toward it. And the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, indicating that the Egyptians fell into the water. And this is what Rabbi Elazar says. What is the meaning of that which is written? Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in that which they conspired, Zadu, against them. Exodus 18:11. And the phrase means, in the pot in which they cooked, they themselves were cooked, as they were punished through drowning, measure for drowning the Jewish babies. And we see this idea and this phraseology comes up often in the Talmud. One who digs a pit for someone else will himself fall into it. And with the pot that he planned to cook someone else, he himself was cooked. We see right here. And the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that this word zadu is a term meaning a pot, like a cooking pot? And the Gemara answers, as it is written, and Jacob simmered a pot, Vayezed Yaakov Nazid, right? So when Jacob was cooking the lentil stew, that Esau came in and was so hungry and wanted to eat it, and Jacob said, sell me your birthright, there too was cooking a pot. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Simai says, 3 noteworthy people were consulted by Pharaoh, right? Who is giving him advice about drown the Jewish babies and we may not suffer consequences? Now that we're talking about Pharaoh's advisors, so who were Pharaoh's advisors? And there were 3 noteworthy people who were consulted in that council where Pharaoh questioned what should be done with the Jewish people. Who were they? Bilaam, Job, and Yisro. It doesn't say that directly in the Torah, but we have this tradition, and now they'll explain why these 3 guys that appear elsewhere in Bilaam in the Torah, Yisro in the Torah, and Job in the book of Job, what were they doing with Pharaoh, being Pharaoh's advisors? So Rabbi Chia bar Abba teaches what occurred to each of them. Bilaam, who advised Pharaoh to kill all sons born to the Jewish people, was punished by being killed in the war with Midian. And by the way, what we do have is that in the Torah we see where Balak, the king, who was concerned about this Jewish people coming into his land, brought the prophet, the non-Jewish prophet Bilaam, to curse the Jewish people. And Bilaam said, I cannot curse whom God will not curse. I can only bless whom God wishes to bless. And he ends up blessing the Jewish people. But it's not that Bilaam was happy about that. And right after that episode, Bilaam advises them, oh, what you really got to do is send your young, sexy, non-Jewish women to seduce the Jewish men. And in that way, you can effectively undermine the Jewish nation and lead them astray. And that, worked a little bit to some extent, but it led to a war, and Bilaam was killed in that war. Yisro, Moses' father-in-law, who ran away first Job. So the three advisors, right? Bilaam, Job, and Yisro said to Pharaoh what you should do. So Bilaam said, oh, these Jews are dangerous. Kill all the Jewish males. You can keep the women as slaves, but get rid of the males. And he was punished measure for measure that he was killed in that war with the Midianites. Job, who was silent and neither advised nor protested, was punished by suffering, as detailed in the book of Job. Yisro, who ran away as a sign of protest, merited that some of his children's children sat in the Sanhedrin in the chamber of hewn stone, as it is stated, and the families of scribes who dwelt at Jabez, Tirathites, Shemithites, Sukkothites, these were the Kenites who descended from Hamath, the father of the house of Rechab, 1 Chronicles 2:5-5, and it is written, the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, in Judges 1:16. And this teaches that the Kenites, descendants of Yisro, the father-in-law of Moses, dwelt at Jabez, referring to the place where the Jewish people go for advice, Eitzah, meaning the chamber of hewn stone. Now you might ask, okay, we get Bilaam should be punished. He's the one who came up with the idea, kill all the Jewish males. And many Jewish males were killed that way. Job, who didn't say anything, ends up suffering. I mean, the suffering of Job in the book of Job is pretty extreme. Now, in the book of Job, it doesn't say anything about that Job deserved it. As a matter of fact, the whole concept of the book of Job is that Job was righteous, right? And the adversary, the Sotah, says to God, well, he's a righteous man because he's got it made. Everything is good in his life. If he were to lose everything, would he be so righteous then? And God says, well, go ahead and test him. And then all the misfortunes of Job follow. And there's a wonderful discourse about why do the righteous suffer in this world that we read in the book of Job. It doesn't say anything about he was an advisor to Pharaoh, but Chazal, right, our sages of blessed memory, looked into that story, and they had a tradition that Job was actually an advisor of Pharaoh. Now, was his silence in the room when Bilaam was advising a genocide worthy of his own suffering to this degree? So says Rav Steinsaltz, the commentaries discuss why Job's silence was punished so severely. Where, they ask, is the measure for measure in his harsh punishment? So some explain that his silence indicated that he agreed with Bilaam. It helped Bilaam's vote to pass, as it were, which caused the advice of Bilaam to be accepted. Therefore, Job was punished with suffering that he had to accept in silence, measure for measure. Others, citing the Zohar, state that Job was not completely silent. Rather, he suggested that the Jewish people not be killed, but rather should be made to suffer financial loss and physical affliction, slavery. Therefore, Job was punished in a similar manner. Whereas Yisro, voted against, maybe didn't speak out loud, but he made clear that this was a terrible idea, and he left Egypt at that very moment. He said, I cannot be part of an evil regime like this. And he merited that his daughter married Moses, and Jethro gets his own parsha, his own Torah portion in the Torah. Now, the verse states, come, let us deal wisely with him, lest he multiply, again, referring to the whole Jewish people in the singular. Come, let us deal wisely with him, lest he multiply, and it come to pass that when there befalls us any war, he will join our enemies and fight against us, and get him out of the land. Now, in this case, the Gemara is not going to comment on the fact that the Jewish people in mass is referred to as a single person, but rather that Pharaoh is saying that that Israel will join our enemies and fight against us and get him up out of the land. So the Gemara comments, Pharaoh should have said, and get us up, right? If this enemy within, this other people living in our land, joins with our enemies from without, some other nation, and they gang up together on us, the Egyptians, what will happen? They will drive the Egyptians out of Egypt. So he should have said, he will fight against us and get us up out of the land. So why did Pharaoh said, get him up out of the land? And Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, by stating this, Pharaoh is like a person who curses himself but applies his curse to another. In other words, he spoke euphemistically. He was trying to say, he didn't want to say that we're going to be driven out of our own land. He didn't want to even say those words. So euphemistically, he's saying, and he will take himself out of the land, but he meant that he would take us out of the land. Now, the next verse states, therefore they did set over him taskmasters in order to afflict him with their burdens. Exodus 1:11. Now, the Gemara comments, it should have stated over them in the plural, not over him in the singular. The school of Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, taught, this teaches that at first they brought a brick mold and they hung it on the neck of Pharaoh to create the appearance that he was also participating in the labor. Right? They would make their own bricks. This was the labor of building in Egypt. And when the Jews were first enslaved, it wasn't like one day there was a law, all the Jews are slaves. Rather, it began as a public service project. Egypt needs everyone to come in and participate and build this thing on behalf of the nation. Everyone needs to participate. Egyptians, Jews, anyone else who is living here. And we're all going to be working alongside Pharaoh. Pharaoh's going to make bricks, so no one is going to say that I can't make bricks. If Pharaoh's making bricks, we're all going to be in it together. So once everybody was out there doing the work, we learn not here but elsewhere, that then what the Egyptians did is they went into the Jewish homes and removed all their weapons so that they couldn't fight back. They had lists of who all the Jews were. They were already in this public service project. And then it was much easier to go the next step and keep them working and then only keep the Jews working and then appoint taskmasters over them and enslave them. But it was a little bit more of a gradual process. It wasn't overnight. At any rate, it started with Pharaoh wearing this mold of making bricks on a chain around his neck to create the appearance that he was also participating in the labor. And with regard to each and every Jew who said to the Egyptians, oh, wait a minute, I'm a delicate person, istenis, and I cannot participate in the labor. And they said to him, are you at all more of a delicate person than Pharaoh? He is participating. Therefore, the verse states, they did set over him, as they first placed the burden of Pharaoh as an artifice to enslave the Jewish people. Now, the term taskmasters, sare misim, is formed from the term a matter that compels, shemesim, the manufacture of bricks, as the Jewish people were forced into labor when these taskmasters were assigned to them. Now the verse continues, in order to afflict him with their burdens, Exodus 1:11. So the Gemara comments, it should have stated in order to afflict them, plural. Rather, the intention is, as mentioned previously, in order to afflict Pharaoh with the result of causing the burdens of the Jewish people. Now the verse concludes, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Miskenot, Pithom, and Ramses. Rav and Shmuel disagree as to the precise interpretation of the word miskanot. One says that they are called this because they were the type of structures that endanger mesakanot, their owners, as it is dangerous to work in cities with tall buildings. It is dangerous to work in cities with tall buildings. And one says that they are called this because this is the type of property that impoverishes, memaskenot, their owners. As the master said, everyone who engages in construction becomes poor. If you've ever engaged in any kind of real estate development, construction, and it ended up being much more expensive than anticipated, here's your source in the Talmud that this has always been so. The verse states that the names of the cities they built were Pithom and Ramses, and Rav and Shmuel disagree as to the precise interpretation of this verse, both assuming that only one city was built, which had primary and secondary names. Now, one says the real name was Pithom, so why was it also called Ramses? It is an appellation indicating that as the buildings were constructed, they collapsed one by one and needed to be rebuilt. And the one that says that Ramses is the real name, why was it called Pithom? Because the opening of the abyss, Pi Tehom, swallowed each building they constructed one by one, and it sunk into the ground. Sounds like they were building heavy buildings in a marsh, and it went badly. Now the next verse states, but the more they afflicted him, the more he would multiply and the more he would spread about. Again, referring to the Jewish people in the singular. Now the Gemara comments, it should have stated, the more they multiplied and the more they spread about, not only plural, but in the past tense. So Reish Lakish says, divine inspiration proclaimed to the Egyptians, as long as this nation is afflicted, the more he will multiply and the more he will spread out. As the verse states, and they became disgusted, vayakutsu, due to the children of Israel. And the Gemara explains this teaches that the Jewish people appeared in the eyes of the Egyptians like thorns, kotzim. The next verse states, and the Egyptians made the children of Israel work, now we're on 11b, with rigor, befarech, Exodus 1:13. So Rabbi Lazar says the word befarech is a conjugation of the words with a soft mouth, bife-rach, as the Egyptians enticed the Jewish people into slavery, gradually subjugating them until they had lost their freedom completely. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says the word befarech should be understood as with crushing, befricha, as the Egyptians subjugated Israel with backbreaking labor. Now the next verse states, and they made their lives bitter through hard service, with mortar and brick, and with every laborious service in the field, Exodus 1:14. Now Rava says the verse mentions specifically mortar and brick, and then all forms of labor, as initially the Egyptians had them work with mortar and bricks, and ultimately they subjugated them, and with every laborious service in the field. Now the verse concludes, in all their service, wherein they made them serve with rigor, Exodus 1:14. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, Rabbi Yonasan says, the meaning of befarech is that the Egyptians would exchange the responsibilities of men and women, giving men's work to women and women's work to men, requiring everyone to do work with which they were unaccustomed. And even according to the one who says that there in the previous verse, befarech indicates that the Egyptians enslaved the Jews with a soft mouth, here in the verse, which describes the physical hardship of the labor, the word befarech certainly means with crushing labor. Now you might say, well, if women were made to do men's work, and generally speaking, particularly in ancient times, men's work was, physical hard labor requiring the strength of men, and it would be all that much more difficult for women to do. But if women's work was done by men, is that backbreaking labor for the men? What does Rav Steinsaltz say, citing Ben Yehoyada? Even though men's work generally requires more physical effort, women's work requires other character traits, such as patience and the ability to pay greater attention to detail, and this causes suffering for one not accustomed to this kind of work. It's a typical subplot or a typical plot in a TV comedy, that the husband and wife, swap jobs to see which is really harder, and the husband quickly learns that he's ill-equipped to perform the wife's duties. Now, Rav Avira taught, in the merit of the righteous women that were in that generation, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. And he tells of the righteous actions of the women of the children of Israel in Egypt. At that time, when these women would go to the river to draw water, the Holy One, blessed be He, would materialize for them small fish that would enter into their pitchers, and they would therefore draw pitchers that were half filled with water and half filled with fish. And they would then come and place 2 pots on the fire, 1 pot of hot water for washing their hands, and 1 pot of fish with which to feed them. seemingly indicating that God was watching over the children of Israel in Egypt. And even though they were forced to do backbreaking labor, nevertheless, you might have thought that under such conditions, their population would dwindle. They were working too hard, for them to feel like, free to reproduce at a large rate. But we know that the Jewish people went into Egypt 70 people strong and came out millions strong. How did they grow so big in a relatively short time? They were reproducing like crazy. So that was kind of miraculous population growth, and God was helping them along. But it wasn't in the merit of the men, it was in the merit of the women, Jewish women. And they, the Jewish women, would then take what they prepared of these fish to their husbands to the field, and would bathe their husbands and anoint them with oil and feed them the fish and give them to drink and bond with them in sexual intercourse between the sheepfolds, i.e. between the borders and fences of the fields. As it is stated, when you lie among the sheepfolds, the wings of the dove are covered with silver and her pinions with the shimmer of gold, Psalm 68:14, which is interpreted to mean that as a reward for when you lie among the sheepfolds, the Jewish people merited to receive the plunder of Egypt. As it is stated in the continuation of that verse, as a reference to the Jewish people, the wings of the dove are covered with silver and her pinions with shimmer of gold. That when Israel left slavery in Egypt, the Egyptians handed them great wealth to compensate them for all the years of backbreaking labor that they did. Right? But again, it was like the women kept up the hope of the future and saying, don't give up, grow the family. Eventually, it's all going to come good, right? It's the women who had that hope for the future when the men had become so demoralized and pessimistic that they would not have had children but for, this merit and hope of the Jewish women. And when these women would become pregnant, they would come back to their homes, and when the time for them to give birth would arrive, they would go and give birth in the field under the apple tree. As it is stated from Song of Songs, under the apple tree I awakened you, there your mother was in travail with you, there was she in travail and brought you forth. And the Holy One, blessed be He, would send from the heavens above an angel who would clean and prepare the newborns just as a midwife prepares the newborn, as it is stated, and as for your birth, on the day you were born, your navel was not cut, nor were you washed with water for cleansing. You were not salted at all, nor swaddled at all. And this indicates that there were no midwives to take care of the Jews born in Egypt. And then the angel would gather for them 2 round stones from the field, and the babies would nurse from that which would flow out of them. One of the stones flowed with oil, and one of the stones flowed with honey, as it is stated, and he would suckle them with honey from a crag and oil from a flinty rock. Deuteronomy 32:13. And once the Egyptians would notice them, realizing that they were Jewish babies, the Egyptians would come to kill them. But a miracle would occur for them, and they would be absorbed by the earth. And the Egyptians would then bring oxen and would plow upon them. As it is stated, the plowers plowed upon my back. They made long furrows. Psalm 129:3. After the Egyptians would leave, the babies would emerge and exit the ground like grass of the field. As it is stated, I cause you to increase even as the growth of the field. Ezekiel 16. And once the babies would grow, they would come like many flocks of sheep to their homes, as it is stated in the continuation of the verse. And you did increase and grow up, and you came with excellent beauty. Ba'adi adayim, Ezekiel 16. Do not read the verses Ba'adi adayim, with excellent beauty. Rather read it as Be'edre adarim, meaning as many flocks. Again, the Jewish people grew exponentially. And when the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself at the Red Sea, these children recognized Him first, as it is stated, this is my God, and I will glorify Him, part of the Song of the Sea, right, which we read in synagogue to commemorate that event on the 7th day of Passover just a few days ago. They recognize Him from the previous time that He revealed Himself to them in their infancy, enabling them to say, this is my God. For those that had their eyes open, even during the slavery in Egypt, it was a time of miracles and of God watching over them and getting near to that final time of the redemption. Now the verse states, and the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of the one was Shifrah and the name of the other Puah. And I see Bill talking, no midwives, what about Shifrah and Puah, right? He's just jumping ahead a paragraph. But I think the idea was, I don't think that Shifrah and Puah, the famous Jewish midwives in Egypt, Were they able to midwife 1 million children being born, right? So it's not everybody had access to Shifrah and Puah. That's my own interpretation. Now, Rav and Shmuel disagree as to the proper interpretation of this verse. One says that these particular midwives were a woman and her daughter, and one says that they were a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law. Now, according to the one who says that they were a woman and her daughter, the women were Yocheved, the mother of Moses and Aaron, and her daughter, right? Moses and Aaron's sister, Miriam. And according to the one who says that they were a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law, the verse is referring to Yocheved, right, Moses' mother, and her daughter-in-law, Elisheva, who was Aaron's wife. Now, it is taught in a baraisa, according to the one who says that they were a woman and her daughter, because it is taught in a baraisa with regard to Shifrah, who is referred to in the verse. This is really a reference to Yocheved. So why was she called Shifrah? Because she would prepare Mishaperet, the newborn. Alternatively, she is referred to as Shifrah because the Jewish people increased and multiplied, Shaparu Verabu, in her days due to her assistance. Now the Brisa continues with regard to Puah, who is referred to in this verse. This is really a reference to Miriam. So why was she called Puah? Because she would make a comforting sound, Po'ah, as she would remove the child from the womb of the mother. Alternatively, the word Puah is related to one of the verbs that describe speaking, as she would speak, Po'ah, through divine inspiration and say, in the future, my mother will give birth to a son who will save the Jewish people. Now, the next verse relates the instructions of Pharaoh to the midwives. And he said, when you deliver the Hebrew women and you look upon the stones of Naim, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Exodus 1:16. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of stones in this context? So Rabbi Hanan says, Pharaoh transmitted a great sign to them. He said to them, at the time when a woman crouches to give birth, her thighs become as cold as stones. And therefore this shall be for you a sign that the woman is about to give birth. And there are those who say an alternative explanation for Ovnaim, as it is written, so I went down to the potter's shop, and behold, he was at his work on the wheels. Ovnaim, Jeremiah 18:3. So just as the potter sits so that one thigh is here and one thigh is there, and the block upon he works is in the middle, so too a woman giving birth also has one thigh here and one thigh there, and the newborn is in the middle. So the verse continues, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. So Rabbi Hanina says, Pharaoh transmitted to them a great sign to enable them to know the gender of the infant from the beginning of the birth process. A boy is born with his face downward. A girl is born with her face upward. I'm sure that doesn't hold true in modern times, but Pharaoh said it would be like that while the Jews were giving birth in Egypt. So Pharaoh provided these midwives with this sign so that they could kill the boys secretly even before the mother realized what was happening. So the next verse states, but the midwives feared God and did not, as the king of Egypt spoke about them, Alechen, but they kept the male children alive. So the Gemara comments, it should have stated, spoke to them, Lahen. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says this teaches that Pharaoh proposed to them to engage in a sinful act, i.e. sexual intercourse with him, but they did not accept his overtures. So the word alehen is often used in reference to sexual intercourse, for example, and brought her to him, and he consorted with her. Elecha, Genesis 29:23, and that is the connotation here as well. Now the verse concludes, but they, the midwives, kept the male children alive. Exodus 1:17. And a sage teaches, it is not only that they did not kill the children as Pharaoh had commanded them, but that they would even provide for them water and food, as the phrase, but they kept the male children alive, indicates not just they didn't kill, but they sustained. So after being questioned by Pharaoh concerning their failure to obey his command, the midwives responded, as it is written, and the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively, chayot, and are delivered before the midwife comes to them. Exodus 1:19. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of chayot? If we say that the Hebrew women are like chayot, meaning actual midwives for themselves, and therefore they do not need assistance from others, is that to say that a midwife does not need the assistance of another midwife in order to help her give her own birth? Rather, the midwife said to Pharaoh, the nation is compared to an animal, chaya, and animals give birth without a midwife. For example, with regard to Judah, it is written, Judah is a lion's whelp. And with regard to Dan, it is written, Dan shall be a serpent in the way. And with regard to Naphtali, it is written, and a hind let loose. These are all the blessings that Jacob gave to his 12 sons, and meaning that, they were the progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. And since these tribes had been likened to animals in Jacob's blessing, now the midwives are saying, okay, so the Jews are like the animals in the field who don't require midwives to give birth. They do it on their own. And likewise, with regard to Issachar, Jacob said, a large boned donkey. And with regard to Joseph, Moses said in his blessings about the tribe, in Deuteronomy 33:17, he is like a bullock. And with regard to Benjamin, Jacob said, a ravenous wolf. So the Gemara comments concerning those individuals where a comparison to an animal is written with regard to him, it is already written with regard to him. And concerning those where no specific metaphor comparing them to an animal is written with regard to him explicitly. So in any case, a general comparison is written about the Jewish people. How your mother was a lioness. Among lions, she crouched. In the midst of the young lions, she reared her whelps, at Ezekiel 19:2, indicating that all the Jewish people are compared to animals in this sense. So the verse relates the midwives' reward for not listening to Pharaoh and not killing the Jewish baby boys. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses, right? In other words, that they became the progenitors themselves of great houses among Israel. And Rav and Shmuel disagree as to the precise interpretation of these houses. One says that God made the houses of the priesthood and the Levites descend from the midwives, right? Because if Shifrah was actually Yocheved, Moses' mother, okay, so then she gave birth to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and they had many great descendants. Right, so the Levites are descended, Yocheved married a Levite and had many more Levites by him, and then one of them was Aaron, and right, the whole, Kohanic line, right, all the priestly line came from Aaron. Right, so one says that God made the houses of the priesthood and the Levites descend from the midwives. And one says that God made the houses of royalty descend from them. Now, the one who says that it is referring to the houses of priesthood and the Levites is referring to Aaron and Moses, who were the sons of Yocheved. And the one who says that it is referring to houses of royalty is referring to King David, who also comes from Miriam. How do we know this? As it is written, and Azubah, the wife of Caleb, died, and Caleb took to him Ephrath, who bore him Hur. 1 Chronicles 2:19. And as it will be explained further, Ephrath is Miriam. As it is written, David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah. Therefore, he was a descendant of Miriam. I should have given a warning. We're done for today. We're going to break there. But actually, we'll just do one more paragraph about Caleb, right? So, who was Caleb? So the Mishna the Gemara discusses the family of Caleb. In Chronicles, it says, and Caleb, the son of Hezron, begot children of Azubah, his wife, and Jerioth, and these were her sons, Jesher and Shobab and Ardon. 1 Chronicles 2:18, and the Gemara asks, was Caleb actually the son of Hezron? Wasn't he the son of Jephunneh? As the verse states in Numbers 13:6, and the Gemara answers, he was the son of Hezron, but he was called the son of Jephunneh as an appellation indicating that he was a son who turned away Shephanah from the council of the spies. So we'll break off there, and we'll continue tomorrow night after Shabbos, Motzi Shabbos, here in LA. So it's it's starting to get into summer hours. It'll be late. But I think candle lighting is 7:05, so I should be able to get on the air tomorrow night, 8:30, 8:45 LA time. Okay, let's see if we've got questions or comments on Sotah, Daf Yud Aleph, page 11 here in Tractate Sotah. Questions. Come on, Google Doc, load. Okay, Gassia asks, so is Job from Rahab? I think that when we're talking about Rahav, right, there we're talking about the woman who helped Joshua, and she ended up marrying Joshua, who helped Joshua lead the children of Israel into the promised land. But Job, we're talking about a different Rahav, I think a region of Rahav, because he would have been, already an advisor to Pharaoh many decades before that. In fact, centuries before that. So we're not talking about the same Rahab there as a progenitor of Job, right? And it's definitely a different reference that they're making, that Job was one of Pharaoh's advisors. Now, Sharon, I did not hear, but are they confirming the marriage of Joshua to Rahab? Yes, but not in reference to Job there. I think we're talking about a different Rahab. Sharon, my sound is cutting on and off, but was this the midrash that the babies thrown into the Nile were miraculously saved and reunited with their families at the Sea of Reeds? We didn't see that in this page, so very interesting. I'm not familiar with that midrash, but we didn't see it here, so that would have been a different source for that. Bill, what I've got in my translation just says birthing stool for stones in this instance. Now there's a lot of variety in translations. I'm just intrigued as to why there's such a gap in this instance. A good thing to research later. And that's why we always say that translation is interpretation, right? Translation is interpretation. And why, I wish my Hebrew was supple enough that I could really, dig in and understand the Torah in its original language. But I mean, even the sages were disagreeing on what the Hebrew means, and they were thousands of years closer to not just, the Hebrew of the Bible, but the tradition that told what these words mean. And here, 2,000 years later, interpreting those words is difficult, and that's why we rely so much on the sages and their understanding of the language. But it is inarguable that when we read in translation, we lose a lot, right? We lose a lot because every translation inserts its own interpretation of the meanings of these words. And as we've seen over and over and over again, Hebrew is a moody language with a kind of smaller word pool where those words are made to do sort of multiple service, multiple meanings. And when a particular word, is used in the Torah, it has kind of its primary meaning in that context, but it brings with it these other meanings that add beautiful color and texture to every verse in the Bible. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night for Sotah, Yud Beis Sotah, page 12. Wishing you a sweet and rejuvenating Shabbos and a continuing mitzvah for those who are counting, the counting of the Omer, the counting of days between Passover and Shavuos.